So welcome to this week's Parsha, Terumah, to our Parsha discussion. And today I want to talk about a very classic machloket debate in the Torah and use this week's Parsha, and as we'll see some of next week and maybe even the following week's Parshiot as an example, and maybe try to apply a little bit of a modern twist to it. So I think we've talked about before in this class the idea of chronology in the Torah, right? So Rashi and most of the classical Mefarshim believe in Mukdam Umuchar b'Torah, that there is no beginning and after in the Torah. And so the Torah is arranged in a way that makes sense, that will give us the right messages, that will help us understand what Hashem is trying to tell us. And it's not concerned about whether, this thing happened first or this thing happens first. The Ramban is pretty much the sole fighter for a strict chronological read of the classical, medieval Mefarshim. And sometimes there's not a big nafkamina, right? A big outcome. It doesn't really matter which one wins. There might be sort of an interesting message, but I think we can see an interesting message here. There is a sort of a nafkamina here about we'll see how it turns out. So the two events in question are the golden calf, the incident of the Chet HaEgel, and the building of the Mishkan. Right, so to remind us, the last two Parshiot were really intense, beautiful Parshiot. There was the Parsha of Yitro, where we got the 10 Commandments, where we had the theophany, which is one of my favorite religious words, right, divine revelation. And there is then the Parsha of Mishpatim, which might be filled with sort of some more dry and boring laws, but is still a very much an experience of direct revelation on some level, maybe not the same thunder and lightning and smoke and all of that, but a very much a direct relationship with God. And then in this week's Parsha, we start right away with directions for how to build the Mishkan. And then over next week's Parsha and the following week, the Chet HaEgel is like an intermission between the directions for building the Mishkan and the building of the Mishkan, right? And so the question here is, what came first, the golden calf or the building of the Mishkan, or the directions even for the building of the Mishkan? Hello, Nelson, welcome. So we just set the stage that we're talking about which came first, the Chet HaEgel, the golden calf, which we'll read about next week, or the building and the instructions for building the Mishkan, which start this week and then carry on after the Chet HaEgel occurs. And so the debate is framed under this concept of whether there's in Mukdam Umuchar b'Torah, whether there's a chronological order in the Torah. And Rashi and most of the classic medieval Mefarshim think there is not, that the Torah is written in just a way that transmits the message in the best way, and they're not concerned with what happened on Monday versus Tuesday. And the Ramban, as we're going to see here, very much wants to stick to the chronology as it is laid out. And I think that in this case, it's both a nice message, and we'll hopefully see an interesting take on that. And also there are some practical nafkaminot, sort of ramifications for which way we view it. So let's jump in with the Rambam. So in this week's Parsha, it says, "V'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham," right? Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. God speaking to Moshe. And the Ramban says here, right? Ka'asher diber Hashem im Yisrael b'panim aseret hadibrot, right? That now that God has told Israel face to face, which we know is not really, right? I think we were talking about this one other time, right? No one actually gets to see God face to face. Even Moshe only sees the back of God, whatever that means. But I think what the Ramban means is in a very direct way, the most direct that we'll ever have with God. We hear the aseret hadibrot, v'tziva'otam al yedei Moshe k'tzat mitzvot shehem kamo avot l'mitzvotah shel Torah, and some of them had been commanded through Moshe, the precepts, which are general principles to the individual commandments of the Torah, right? Ka'asher hanhigu rabotenu im hagerim sheba'im hit yahed. In the same way, this is an interesting sort of detail the Rambam throws in, the same way that we deal with converts, potential converts, right? Is that we teach the Torah through general precepts, and then the details sort of get filled in later. Yisrael kablu alehem lasot kol ma yetzivam al yedei yado shel Moshe. Right, and Bnei Israel has taken upon themselves everything that has been commanded to them. The kareti mahem brit al kol zeh, and there was a covenant made between us and God. Ne'atahine hem lo la'am vehem v'hu lahem la'elohim. Right, that we will be like a nation to God, and God will be our God. Kasher hitaneh imahem mitchila. Right now, he's just reminding us of the psukim of where we sort of accepted God's covenant and became his divine nation. I'm just going to skip forward a little bit here to the period. Okay, so this is the idea, right? Is that the Rambam is setting the stage. The last two parshiot were this divine encounter. We become God's holy nation. We accept the mitzvot. We accept God as our God. God accepts us as his nation. It's this really beautiful and intense theophany, right? Divine interaction. And the Rambam is saying, so now, Tzivat Techila al Davar HaMishkan, right? Why would this come immediately following that? It feels like, right, it's like when someone tells you, I love you, will you marry me? And then you're like, and now let's pull out the architecture plans for the house that we'll build in Skokie Valley, right? It feels like we just were talking about love, and now you want to talk about whether you want like a fancy black splash in your kitchen, right? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't connect. And so the Ramban is saying that this is why God talks about the mikdash, shahayu lo bait betocham mikudash lishmo, because God needed a house there where he could yidaber im Moshe v'yitzaveh et bnei Israel, where he could speak to Moshe and command Bnei Israel. V'hine ikar hachafetz b'mishkan hu makom menuchat shechina shehu ha'aron. Right, the main purpose of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, was to contain a space in which the divine glory rests. This being the Aron, right? And then there'll be an explanation of why he thinks that, right, from the Psukim. And that is right. That's why he talks about the Aron first, and then the Torah, right? Then it's a little bit gets into the details. What the Ramban is saying here is you have this amazing divine interaction, and after that, you need somewhere for it to go, right? You need somewhere for it to rest. Bnei Israel needed sort of maybe to be able to channel that divine energy that they experienced in a way that made sense to them. And so, of course, God was going to make a house for God's self to live in, because God had just had this, beautiful interaction, the marriage of Bnei Israel and God. God is making the house in which God will live through this marriage. And so from the Ramban's perspective, it makes perfect sense. And I think that Rabbi David Moshe Umberto Cassuto is his Italian name. He writes in his commentary, I think, a very sort of similar idea, put in a very beautiful way. Right, he says, we must realize that the children of Israel, Bnei Israel, after they have been privileged to witness the revelation of God on Mount Sinai, were about to journey from there and thus draw away from the site of the theophany. So long as they were encamped in that place, they were conscious of God's nearness. But once they set out on their journey, it seemed to them as though the link had been broken, unless they were in the midst of a tangible symbol of God's presence among them. And maybe this is because I experienced a loss this week, but for me, I was thinking about it as like when someone you love dies, you think, oh, their memory will never fade away, right? I'll never forget how they sound or what they looked like. But you need a picture of them on your mantle, right? Or you need their special item, a watch or a tie or whatever the thing is to wear to sort of feel close to them. It's not enough actually to have the memory of an experience. You need something to tie you to that memory. And so in this way, in a much more lively and embodied way, right? Bnei Israel are the same, that after they leave the revelation, after they leave the theophany, they need something that will hold them to that divine presence amongst them. And that, right, the Rabbi Cassuto saying the same way that the Ramban did, that's the function of the Mishkan, is that it allows you to have that connection. And I think that is a really powerful, beautiful idea, right? That God was on Har Sinai, and then God needed another place to go, right? And I think that it's not really from God's perspective, but from our own perspective, right? That we need that space, but God wanted it, right? God, it's even in the words of the Rambam, he uses the word chafetz, right? God wanted a space to be with the people, which I think is a really beautiful example of like meeting us where we are, maybe. So that is the argument. That's the case to be made for no out of order chronology, right? This happens directly after Har Sinai because it's just a logical extension of the relationship that God and Bnei Israel built on Har Sinai. So now, unless anyone, please feel free to jump in. Now we can move to the other perspective, and I brought the Midrash Tanchuma instead of Rashi here, because I could have given this year this week or next week, or maybe even the week following, because each week we talk about it as we go from the instructions to the Mishkan, to the Egel HaZahav, to the building of the Mishkan, right? And so Rashi talks about it more next time, and less this time. But the Midrash Tanchuma here in Terumah, on the same pasuk, asks this question. He says, when did Moshe talk about the architecture of the Mishkan, how to build the Mishkan? B'Yom HaKippurim atzmo. It was on the Day of Atonement. Even though we're reading it now before the Egel HaZahav, he's saying it's on Yom Kippur, which we know is to be after the Egel, right? Because it takes, they work their way sort of backwards, but we have to take their word for it that Yom Kippur is after the Egel. And so the Midrash is saying this is not in order. Even though we're reading it this way, we know, right, that Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shalom says, Ein mukdam u'muchar b'Torah, and they have a proof text, right, that the Torah sort of arranges itself how the Torah wants. And so it was not until Yom Kippur, it was not until after the Egel HaZahav that God told Moshe to make a Mishkan, a Mikdash for God. And the Midrash explains a little bit in Pekudei, Davar Acher, right, another comment on the Mishkan. Mishkan edut l'kol ha'umot, right? Why is it called the Tabernacle of Testimony? It's testimony to all the nations of the world. Shenitratzeh HaKadosh Baruch Hu liYisrael al ma'aseh ha'egel. That God was willing to reconcile over the Egel. It's a sign of like an olive branch, right? Even though you made such a big mistake and you did the golden calf, God's saying, I still want you to have a mikdash. I still want to come be with you, right? And when they made the Egel, Moshe stands up to God, but he made Alehem Sanegoria, right? He was the advocate, the defense attorney. And he says, right? When will they know that you have forgiven them? He says, tell them to make me the mikdash. And that's how everyone will know that God forgave Bnei Israel. And so right here, the believing in the principle of chronology or no chronology brings you to understand the Mishkan in radically different ways, right? The Ramban sees it as like a further gift, the after the wedding gift of God to Bnei Israel, because the love is so strong. And the Midrash Tanchuma sees it as like an apology, a sign that things had been broken but are now repaired. And we see this play out later in 2 weeks Parshiot, right? It says what happens once you've built the Mishkan. So we've gotten the directions, we've seen the Egel HaZahav incident, and then we've come back to actually making the Mishkan, and we're ready to consecrate the Mishkan. And the pasuk says to take a par echad ben bakar ve'elim shtayim tmimim. And Rashi says, why take a par echad? What is the significance of that animal? The chaper al maaseh ha'egel shehu par. right? So because the golden calf was a calf, we should use a calf to apologize. And that this is an apology offering, right? Because the Mishkan is actually almost like a consequence or a natural outcome of Bnei Israel not being able to stand, not having some kind of physical reminder of God. We have to apologize in some way. So our very first offering in the Mishkan is an apology to God. And on the other hand, in Tehillim, in the Midrash Tehillim, using this pasuk as like a jumping off point, the Midrash says the offering of thanksgiving in the temple did not serve as an atonement. The only purpose of the thanksgiving offering was giving thanks, right? And again, think how different that must have felt for Aaron if you're coming in feeling like you're making an apology versus you're coming in saying, wow, Hashem, you gave us this beautiful natural extension of the theophany, right? Where now I can give thanks to you in this space. It really makes the whole set of Parshiot read differently, depending which way you think about it. So, time is flying by here. Maybe we could pause here if anyone has thoughts, if one way resonates more with you than the other. Like who's on
that book?
Yeah, go ahead, Sherry.
You know that book, The Midrash Says?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I read it after I read the Torah portion, and it said that the measurements and the placement and the whole construction of the Mishkan is a reflection of what God's throne and God's place in heaven is like.
That's cool. I like that.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting.
So that I think could be read a little bit as more as the Ramban, maybe, right? That it's just God sort of getting comfy here on earth. It's the measurements of God's throne in, it's like if you have like a Shabbos house, right? The Mishkan is God's Shabbos house. Yeah, that's beautiful. Anyone feel like they're more inclined towards the Team Rashi or the Midrash Tanchuma to view it as like a consequence of sorts? So, go ahead, Nelson. Are you going to say something?
No, I think they're all valid. Each one catches one aspect. It's like a personality. I know.
Amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. I know a child's book. It's called Quick as a Cricket. Are you familiar with that one?
No.
It was like this. The child started, I'm as quick as a cricket. I'm as slow as a clam. So I'm like the whole zoo. And the child has one aspect of each one. And, and I think each rabbi captures one aspect. And
I love that. It is you stole the punchline right out of my mouth, which is amazing.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's good.
I
talk too much. I should keep my mouth shut.
No, it's very good. It's very good. We think alike. Really, you think like Dr. Aviva Zorenberg. So Dr. Aviva Zorenberg has written beautiful books, commentaries on the Torah. And when she talks about this week's Parsha in her book, The Particulars of Rapture, she asks the question. I was kind of banking on no one being on Team Rashi, and I was going to say, Dr. Zorenberg picks up on that. She says, it feels a little bit like a forced read. Why insist that the golden calf come first? And so she goes through a lot of different reasons that maybe it does belong first. And she lands exactly where Nelson lands. And she writes so beautifully. I redacted heavily because it's, pages upon pages. But I think she asks good questions. And the way that she constructs it is that we have to think of it as two different narratives, a comedy and a tragedy. And she says, right, so the Ramban's perspective is the comedy. The comedy is represented by God's perspective, from which the Mishkan is inevitable. The desires and longings of the patriarchs and matriarchs of generations of spiritual aspiration make such a meeting between God and the human a necessity. In this comic reading, the golden calf is an episode, an incidental problem after which the original concept of the Mishkan is restored. I think she sums up Kasuto and the Ramban just so beautifully, right? The golden calf is not the disaster that maybe we're taught to think it is. It's just a bad thing. It's like when the Bnei Israel complain about the water, when they want the Slav, whatever the things are in the desert, this is yet another obstacle. But the Mishkan is the Mishkan, because that is something that has been coming to us from generations and generations of longing, which I think is like it's our inheritance in some ways, right? But the other interpretation, the Rashi Midrash side, is as a tragedy. This is represented by the human perspective. This tragic narrative, too, is essential. Without the golden calf, God will not bring his presence to rest in their midst, right? Sometimes we think of those consequences as being a weakness, but I think what Dr. Zorenberg is pointing out is that without it, it might not have happened, right? In this tragic reading, the experience of sin is the very means by which the transcendent and the human realms can find a potential space for interplay, right? We need that as humans. And so if you don't think it goes in chronological order, then God was just waiting for the right moment to unveil it, is maybe the way to think about it, right? And that if we had not had the golden calf, then perhaps we would not have had that space, that space where the transcendent and the human can be together. When the Mishkan is commanded, it is more than a mere concession to human weakness, more even than a homeopathic therapeutic gesture. It represents an impossible idea, a project that has already been proven disastrous. It arises out of a fire that would be unknown to the people if they had not been singed by it. She has this beautiful reading about how fire plays a very prominent role in both the Mishkan and the golden calf, that there's like a lot of parallelism between the two, that when in this week's Parsha, when God commands Moshe all the different pieces, it talks about these 4 different fires, and right, that sort of parallels the fire in which they throw the gold and the golden calf comes out. And that there are lots of sort of pieces, right? We say that God can't be captured in any image, but we know that in the Mishkan over the Aron are the 2 cherubim, right? The 2 kruvim, and those have a human face, and they surround the Mishkan. And what Dr. Zorenberg says is like the golden calf was supplanting the idea of the Mishkan. The kruvim make space. They make a space for God. They frame it, maybe is the way to think about it, right? And so it's almost as if the Mishkan is saying, like, listen, you wanted to use fire, you wanted to use an image, let me show you the right way to do those things. And so then you can sort of understand why Rashi wants the Yael has to go first, because you want to sort of understand that parallelism, that the Mishkan is really the perfect place. And so I think both readings take on more beauty through her words. But then, as Nelson said so beautifully, I love what she says. She says at the end. At first, I thought like, oh, maybe this is like a little heretical, and I was already like crazily heretical the last time I spoke in Shul, so maybe I shouldn't put this here. But then I thought I like the book idea that you put out, Nelson, right? That there are just so many shivim panim laTorah, right? That we say there are so many ways to read things. And so her conclusion to this chapter is that for the reader of the Torah, however, there remains the double reading, the comic and the tragic interpretations of the same drama. As in an Esher engraving, the text of the Torah flickers with ambiguity, and the reader experiences that inner shift that destabilizes the idolatrous security of meaning. Perhaps only a text that flickers in this way can maintain its power through time. Right? It's so beautiful. Like, I want to put it on my wall somewhere, because I think it gives credence to both. It allows you as the reader to feel secure in your reading, and it also pushes you to not feel secure and to understand that there's another perspective. It's gorgeous. And I think that at different times in history, we might be drawn to one, the comic or the tragic, and that they both are powerful. It's such a beautiful. I'm not going to say anything else. I'm going to let Dr. Zorenberg have the last word of my words, but I welcome your words if you have thoughts and ideas.
I don't see how I forgot who said it, that that the golden calf could be considered something minor. I mean, that's idol worship. How can we just like blow it off and say, oh, that's no big deal? It is a big deal.
Totally. I agree with you. It is a big deal.
Yeah,
But I think,
I mean, it's the opposite of what we're supposed to do, right? We're not
right,
supposed
it
to
goes, yeah, it goes against one of the 10 commandments, which we just received, right?
Yeah,
100%. But I think that what Dr. Zornberg is saying is that there are many of these incidents that take place throughout the Midbar for sure, right? The desert time is like a time of grave sin all around. And it also takes place sort of within the context of a history of sinning, and that the golden calf was not going to be the ending of the people, right? That it wasn't maybe that, not that it's not a problem, right? It's incidental in like the history of the relationship of God and the people. I don't know if you've ever had like a fight maybe with someone, right? Where like you walk away and you think like, that's the end. I'm never going to see that friend again, right? And the friend says, well, we had a fight, no big deal. And I think that's maybe what Dr. Zornberg is saying, is that from our perspective, right, the tragic reading of the experience of sin was this horrible thing. And without the Mishkan, we wouldn't have been able to survive with, it was only our human weakness that was pushing it. And she's saying, well, no, wait, there's another way to read this in which the Mishkan was always going to be built. And the golden calf was like a big, important, significant, but a bump in the road of our longer term relationship. Does that sit better?
I mean, Moshe would not have broken the first set of the 10 commandments if it was no big deal. I mean, it was obviously a big deal.
Definitely a big deal. I will say, and maybe we'll look at this next week. I think that's when the commandments, the tablets get broken, is I think that there's a lot of ambiguity, right? The sort of double readings that she refers to here throughout this whole story. And it's a little bit unclear why Moshe breaks the tablets and whether God wanted Moshe to break the tablets or whether this was like Moshe's rage coming out. But I think that, right, we read the story, and maybe that's like the biggest thing that I think is interesting about this, is we commit to the reading of the Midrash and to the reading of Rashi very early on. And then we follow it because that's the way that we've come to understand it. But if we had tried on the Ramban's hat earlier, maybe we would have interpreted Moshe's breaking of the tablets as a different thing, right? That's another interesting like consequence thing, right? Is that we say that the first tablets were written by God and the second tablets were written by Moshe's own hand. And that the Torah is only consumable to humans from that human perspective, as opposed to the God perspective, right? And so maybe those tablets were bound for breaking from minute one. Is possible.
We don't know.
That the golden calf was the thing that broke the camel's back, but that they might not have ever come down the mountain.
Yeah.
But it does. It turns the narrative on the head of what we understand it to be, for sure.
Can I say something?
Please.
I'm thinking this way: if all you have received commandments and laws in the abstract, like "Thou shalt not have the worship idols," and leave it like that, that would be an abstract, arid, dry commandment that we really would be easy to forget. Now, if we worship a golden calf and Moshe scared us by breaking the tablets of the law, and God, like Aviva Zornberg says, we were singed by the fire. That gives a little scar. Okay, I'll remember that. Like a passion tochas that you get when you do something real bad from your parents, to protect yourself, not more like educational kind of little lesson. That's the way I'm thinking right now.
Yeah, I think so. My kids are very interested in lighting their own Shabbat candle. And like first they just wanted to light the candle once I struck the match. Now they fight over who gets to strike the match. And I thought like, well, in this controlled environment, it's better to let them strike the match. If they do burn their finger, they'll learn for next time, and I'll be right there to blow out the match and not cause a fire and bring an ice cube. And, and I think that we could think about the golden calf almost like that, like a sort of controlled learning experiment that maybe got out of hand for sure. Right. But God says, like, Moshe, you better go back down there. The people are getting too raucous. Right. And I think that Aviva Zornberg's point, as Nelson said, is that had we not had that interplay with fire, we wouldn't have been able to make the Mishkan. We wouldn't have understood how the fire worked in the same way. We would have been stuck with like some godly idea that we wouldn't have known what to do with. And that somehow like that helped us, that experience of the Egel helped us recommit to the Mishkan or use it better. I'm not sure exactly what the right analogy is there. And I was thinking a little bit, and maybe, I don't know, Anna, maybe like this will sit with you, is like, I was wondering, like the Ramban developed this idea that he believes in the chronology of the Torah, not just based on this example, but many, many other examples. And I wonder if like sometimes when you have a sort of a worldview that shapes the way you think about things, and it doesn't fit one thing, what do you do about it, right? Did like the Ramban like this, like he writes so beautifully about this relationship between God and the people becoming, sort of personified through the Mishkan. So maybe he doesn't have that problem here, but like, what if he wished that he could have read it as the golden calf being a big problem, but it just didn't fit inside his conceptual understanding of the Torah? I don't know. I think it's always interesting to look at examples of broader concepts and how they work out. But I guess the only other thing I would say in defense of it is I think that the Midrash Tehillim is very beautiful to say, I don't want the first sacrifice in the Mishkan to have been an I'm sorry. That doesn't feel like a powerful, intentional way of communicating with God. I want it to be this offering of thanks for giving us the space to carry God through the desert with us. And so, that puts the Egel in a different perspective. You sort of get to pick and choose like what's more important. I don't know. A lot to think about. But I do want to leave us with that idea that I think that the text of the Torah beautifully holds both sides of the drama for us, and that there's space to see both of them, and that is what gives it such great power, and that is such a beautiful way to walk into Torah reading, to think that Shivim Panim LaTorah, and each one gives it its own power and helps make it relevant over time in a really strong way. So I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom. And I hope, I don't know if you're getting the same ice storm we're getting here, but I hope everyone stays safe. And
Right. Oh, it's supposed to hit you too, huh, Michigan?
Yeah. That's what I thought. I saw that on one of those WhatsApps. So I hope everyone stays safe and dry and warm, and that by March 12th, we can talk about springtime coming and it will feel real and not pretend.
Thank you. Be safe.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Toda Rabba. Thank you.
Thank you.